Well, good evening to you, ladies and gentlemen, and welcome once again to another edition of Beverly's Times Past. My name is Ed Josephs, and tonight's edition we're going to feature a little look back in history into the history of the Beverly Fire Department. And we have as guests this evening three distinguished gentlemen, all of whom who retired as deputy fire chiefs here with the Beverly Fire Department, and we have them all sitting together here in the studio this evening. On my far right, we have Mr. John Ambrefe, and in the middle, we have Mr. Robert May, and on my immediate right, Mr. William McPherson. William McPherson. Fellas, thank you so much for coming on this evening to Times Past, and I was sitting here thinking just before we started the tape that this might be a little bit of a unique situation, since you were telling me that as deputy fire chiefs, you really got to see each other during the course of the working day, each of you having different shifts to attend to, even though you were working along in the same years, same era. So we welcome you to Times Past, and John, why don't we start with you and get just a little background of your history, personal history?
Okay. I was born August 5, 1919 in Beverly. My parents were Italian immigrants, and my father was a gardener in one of the estates in Beverly Farms. I grew up in the Beverly Farms area, went to school grammar school there, played baseball in the 7th and 8th grade, the baseball team we had. Graduated finally from the grammar school, went to Beverly High School, went 4 years at the high school at Colon Street Center. I think it's Briscoe School now. And I played 2 years of varsity football there. I graduated there. I went to agricultural school for a year, took up horticulture and landscape gardening. And I graduated from there and worked a year or two, and along came the war. December of 1941, I guess, I joined the U.S. Air Force, Army Air Force. They sent me down to Panama, and I wound up through a communication school, taking Morse code and so forth. And then they shipped me to the 24th Fighter Squadron at Panama. I stayed there about 3 years, came back, had a furlough for about a month. I was sent over to New Mexico it was, I guess. Was going to go to Pacific, but the war ended, and I get home in the late part of 1945.
Uh-huh.
Now, do you want to know how I got on the fire department?
I sure do.
When I came back, there weren't very many jobs available. I went to the United Shoe, and the best I could do, they put me up to work and taking care of the golf course grounds around the clubhouse, and no job in the wintertime. So I wanted security, so I looked towards a civil service exam. I took several of them. One of them was happened to be the Beverly Fire Department, which I passed, and finally got pointed to that. From there on, you want to know what happened to me in that?
Well, how many years, John, did you work for the department?
34.
34. Okay. Robert May, can we hear a little bit about your personal history?
I was born in 1922 here in Beverly. My parents lived in Beverly. My grandfather lived in Beverly Farms. And grew up and went through the local school system and joined the Air Force. Went to South Pacific in Japan. Came back and took this job, took the exam for civil service for the fire department. While I was waiting to get appointed, I was appointed call man while I was working at the United Shoe. So I had a job at the United Shoe and also call fireman at the same time. And finally got a permanent appointment, and then took the promotional exams as they came along, and got to be deputy chief. Retired after about 36 years, I guess, counting the call service.
You know, was there any particular motivating factor, Bob?
Well, my grandfather was a call fireman.
Uh-huh.
My father was a permanent fireman. So I grew up in a household of firefighters.
I see. I see.
And that's where I probably got my interest.
Absolutely. Bill McPherson.
Ed, I was born in 1924. My dad, born and brought up here in Beverly, and his father before him was a call man down at Hose 2, down there in the corner of Rantoul and School Street. And I suppose it was more or less inbred in the boys, McPherson boys, because there were 4 of us on the job. There were 3 of us on the job, along with my father at one time. Anyway, went through the local school system here, and graduated in '42, joined the Navy. I was a radioman second in the amphibious forces in the Pacific. Came out, and like Bob, got a job over the United Shoe, was a call man at the same time, and the 3 of us went on permanent there in '48.
Uh-huh. Being a call fireman was part of the growing into the fire department system, was it not?
That was the on-the-job training, so-called. You were assigned to a company, and when the whistle blew for an alarm of fire, if your company responded, you had to go. That was 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. And for the grand sum total of $100 a year, if you mention that today, they'd think you were something loose upstairs there for $100 a year.
I should say. But as we say,
But it
that
was worth it just to get out of work, walk out of the United Shoe, and leave all the other guys looking out the window at us as we walked out.
that was your apprenticeship, really.
That's right. That's
And
right.
After a period of years as call fireman, obviously you were appointed to the regular department or
That's
force, as it were. How many years were you deputy chief, by the way, John?
Geez, I can't remember. Quite a few. I can't remember. 20 years?
I had the lease. They were both deputies long before I was.
I was appointed in '57, and I retired in '89.
I see. Now, are there deputy chiefs for each shift? Is this how the system works?
That's correct.
There are 3, basically 3 shifts.
We have 4 now.
4 now.
4 shifts.
42 hours a week, we have 4.
So there would be 4 deputies down there.
Oh, by the way, Ambrefe brother was the first combination brothers deputy chief of Beverly Fire Department. I want you to put that.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
right.
And that reminds me, Bill, you had a mayor in your family history.
Yes, my grandfather was mayor 2 terms there in World War I.
Back in the teens.
Yeah, and John was talking about family there. My dad and I served together as deputy chiefs for 3 years, and then later on it was my brother Don and I served as deputy chiefs.
Isn't that
I was
something?
second.
Yeah.
You were second.
Well, let's talk about a few of the guys who were around. We throw out some names this evening, who were around on the force, maybe in charge of various shifts and all, when you came on as a regular fireman. And Bob, could we start maybe with your recollections of those early days as a fireman?
Well, when in those days they had a chief and an assistant chief, and a captain usually, and one captain in each station, and they didn't have any lieutenants, and that was it. There was really no structure for as it is today, lieutenants, captains, and deputy chiefs, then chiefs. It was just
Who was fire chief, Bob, when you were?
when I came on as Creasy was chief and Fred Wittenhagen was assistant chief.
He later was to become
Chief.
chief. And John, can you recall who some of the men might have been when you joined the force, some of the old veterans that were on
The old veterans in charge of my ship was Deputy Dooling, Fred Dooling, and Deputy McPherson.
been your father, Bill?
My father.
Yeah.
Yeah.
They were in.
They
lead
were the
men.
in-charge men, Any of the guys still who joined about your time still on the force, or have they all retired out as you have at this
I
point?
can't think of any.
Mostly all gone by now, I would
yes.
say. Yeah. How about yourself, Bill? Who was in charge running the ship in your first years down there?
Well, like Bob said, Chief Cressy was chief up until the last part of 46, and Fred Wittenhagen took over. And as they mentioned, there was Fred Doolin was a deputy chief, and Mel Jones was another deputy chief that we served under when we first came on the job.
Yeah.
And some of the captains were Captain Tuig, Callaley, who later became chief, Pat Driscoll, and Leo Murphy, and Doc Beverly.
It sounds like there was ample opportunity to grow within the system, to rise up in rank, as may or may not be the case today, I'm not sure, but it sounds like many of you fellows rose up from the very lower echelons right up to near the top.
Yeah, we did, but we had the opportunity that the old timers didn't have, because we enjoyed shorter hours, which meant more shifts, and each shift required more officers. So we had there was more job opportunities open up in the higher echelons for us than it ever was for the old timers.
I see. Bill, did you want to say something?
Well, I think right after the war, like Bob was mentioning, there are a lot of returning veterans who had taken the exam, and I think it was a case of becoming active politically and trying to create shorter hours, and that meant more manpower.
I think the veterans had a little influence.
I think we were all banging on doors and trying to.
John, you were telling me that when
I saw the opportunity. I fell in love with the job right off the bat. I saw the opportunity of going up the ladder, and I took every opportunity I could. A hell of a lot of wealth of material of firefighting out there, and I tried to build myself up as much as I could. Then we went to rescue school, how to take people out of a class building and so forth. Then I took an EMT course, and every 2 years I had to go by and recertified. And then North Shore Community College opened up a course in 2 years of fire science and administration. I took that, and then I finally went over to Salem State and got my degree in BS. So I saw the opportunities. I tried to get to the top. I quite couldn't make it, but I tried to get to the top.
Well, you were telling me before we taped here that many of the veterans brought back out of the military some new ideas with them. That were later on to be incorporated into the various departments.
Changed a lot in a few years. Speed was everything. New equipment, and it changed all aspects of firefighting.
Yeah, and you also said that some of the old veterans at that time did not receive you younger fellas with a welcome
I can
arms.
remember Deputy Bill's father giving me hell for attacking a fire of pre-connected 1.5 inch line. So those days they wanted big lines. That the equipment came through with pre-connected, lightweight 1.5 inch line, and you could put water in the fire very, very quickly.
Sure.
Bob can tell you, he was a director.
Well, we came back, the World War II, there was a lot of innovations made. We came back with fog nozzles and foam. The old timers, they never handled foam or fog nozzles or breathing apparatus, or all these things were developed during World War II, and then we brought them back and they were bewildered. They didn't know what we were talking about.
I imagine many of these fellas would have dated back to the horse and wagon.
Oh, definitely, yeah, certainly they were. Yeah.
I can remember in the old station, looking at it from the rear of the building on the far right-hand side, they used to keep a pung there just in case of emergency.
Yeah.
And in case we had a real bad snowstorm, they were going to rent a couple of horses and load the pung with hose and a couple of old soda and acids.
I can remember as a little kid, bad snowstorms, and they would go down to Public Works and borrow a couple of their horses.
Now you got to tell us what the word pug means for the younger generation.
It's a
Little
it's,
sleigh.
it's a wagon cut down on top of some runners. There were 4 runners there, and you had a couple of horses up front that would pull the thing through the snow. But of course, way back in those days, the one piece of fire apparatus, if any apparatus was going to get through, it would have been the Aaron's Fox. That had a motor on it that you could drop it in a low gear, and it was high off the ground.
Yeah.
And the snow had to be pretty deep to stop that from getting in there.
Okay. Well, Bob, what was it like to be a rookie fireman on the department? Was there a lot of hazing that went on? And,
No, not with me, because I've been hanging around the fire station ever since I was a tad, taking my father's dinner down there and hanging around, and always stopped in and, get warm or,
Yeah.
I just grew into it,
Yeah.
just naturally.
Yeah. Well, it is run in a semi-militaristic kind of fashion, and I would think that maybe the rookies may have to pass a few tests now and then, Bill.
Well, I think that Bob and I were fortunate in that, like he said, back in those days in the elementary school, you'd go home for lunch and then back around 1 o'clock, and this is when we'd bring our father's lunch to the stations, and then on the long day on, we'd bring their suppers down to them, and we'd get to hang around there and listen to some of the wild stories that were being told, and when they'd get a little heavy, someone point to the door and we'd have to leave. But I think that Bob and I were fortunate in that some of the older members on the job, when we came on, they knew that we knew the ropes a little bit better than some of the other fellows who hadn't been exposed to this or that, and we were fortunate in that respect.
I didn't get any. I'm a different background. I didn't get any harassment. Although the gang that I went to work with, I would say they were all in the mid-50s. They were a pretty old crowd.
Yeah.
My gang that I went to work with down the farm the first time.
Yeah.
But they treated me fine.
Yeah. Well,
But Bob was mentioning here a minute ago about the veterans coming back with a background in the new equipment and so forth. The Navy was one of the real proponents of the fog nozzle, the Chemox mask, and that. And I think about every fellow that went through boot camp had to go through a firefighting course, and then as you were assigned to the ships, if you were at San Diego or Pearl Harbor, they had a fine 2-week program, and then of course your division officers you'd have drills every week, and I was surprised that the Beverly Fire Department, we didn't have one fog nozzle there. We came on, I think the first one Fred Wittenhagen bought, and I know when it was used to Solo's garage, it was a Saturday morning, and I think they had about 8 or 9 cars in there parked, and they were all going at once, and I know Fred showed up, and he was asking my father how they made out with the fog nozzle first time. They bought one fog nozzle, and they gave it an engine 2, because at that time they used to transport the Gulf gasoline up country way, and they'd come up out of Water Street on a Rantoul and go up School Street on the river, and then pick up the highway and go up to Maine, New Hampshire, and Vermont that way. So they figured that if any station in town needed a fog nozzle, it would be the one where the gasoline trucks were passing by.
yeah. Ladies and gentlemen, we're sitting here this evening with John Ambrefe and Robert May and William McPherson, all of whom are retired deputy fire chiefs here, City of Beverly Fire Department. I would like to take a little bit of time, gentlemen, if we could, to go back in history a little bit and talk about the early days of the fire department. And basically, I think we could maybe stick to the environs of Beverly, but not necessarily do we have to. Bob, do you have any information about how things were around here in Beverly in the very early days in terms of what happened when a fire would occur?
Well, the only thing that I know is I've tried to find some info, and the earliest fire suppression system was the Washington Hose Club.
Okay.
And that consisted of a bucket brigade and some ladders, and was all volunteer. And only the well-to-do belonged to this club. It wasn't open to the common, didn't seem to be open to the common, the worker man. If you look at the membership, they were all prominent merchants or businessmen in town. And maybe they're the only ones that could afford to buy the leather buckets. No one else had any money. But that's how it started, and then finally the town grew, and technology, the hand pumping engines replaced the fire buckets, and finally the town took it over.
And various stations,
Various
substations
stations around,
would pop up here and there over the city.
And I was reading a piece today on a fire that happened in 1844 where the National Bank is, and that burnt down that whole block. And at that time, Beverly had 3 hand pumps and a sail car, and that's all they had.
Wow.
And they relied on Salem to supply most of the firefighting.
Yeah.
After that fire, they went out and bought more equipment and sort of brought it up to date for that time.
I would imagine, John, way back 100, 200 years ago, when a fire got started, there was little hope of saving much of anything, particularly chimney fires, fireplaces, and all of that were prevalent back in those days. Once the thing got going, it was a done deal.
You're right. Right to the ground. We used to call it a cellar saver sometimes.
Well, way back 200 years ago,
Yeah.
they appointed a fire ward, and he carried his badge of authority was about a 5-foot staff with an emblem on the top, and he determined what houses were going to get blown up and what houses were going to be saved. What would they do in order to, if they couldn't extinguish the fire, which happened most of the time, they blew up the adjoining building so it wouldn't spread.
Wow.
That's still a technique in some places,
Sure.
firestorm and so forth.
Sure. Yeah.
Make a fire break.
Yeah. Bill?
I know that over there in Weber Avenue, and the people still run across it, they used to make these cement forms that for water mains, and they supply the different areas around here. It was over there, over where Fred Bartlett and the Connor family are over there. It used to be a little plant over there, and there was a sleeve that fit in, and they'd put a little cement around it, and different lengths, of course, and but like Bob said, it was a social club, a social and a political club.
This is what I wanted to ask you fellas about. In our pre-tape conversation, you were talking about how perhaps if one was interested in politics, it wouldn't be a bad idea if they were involved with the fire department, this type of thing. Am I correct, Bob?
That's right. Yeah. Speaking of the water, the pipes, before the pipes they had cisterns, which were just great big wells, and with a cover on it, and they used to pump the water out of those cisterns. And there was one right in front in Ellis Square, there was one down at Cabot and Union Street, and one down near the bridge. They were all over. And after from cisterns they went to the wooden water mains. They take a log and bore a 4-inch hole through the middle of it, and that became the water main.
Whoa.
And that's where the term water fire plug comes from, because if you wanted to get water, you pulled the plug in the water main and allowed it to come up to spout, and that was the fire plug.
I'm told there was one of that type down at Gloucester Crossing, and the animals used to feed down there, water themselves down there. The cows would come down into Gloucester Crossing,
Yeah.
about opposite where the church is down there, next to the package store. There was a kind of an old water tap down there, and the farmers used to
How
bring
long
their...
ago was that?
Well, Walter Richardson, matter of fact, remembers that as a little boy. He grew up down there, and this would go back into the 20s or so. And the
Didn't
cows would
Chief
water.
Grant live down there?
He did.
On the
Yeah.
corner of Lennox and the Cabot, or right around that
and,
area?
before him, Levi Goodyew lived up there somewhere around Lennox Street, because I remember some old timers talking about they used to keep his carriage with one horse there at the Friend Blacksmith
Yeah,
shop.
Seth Friend.
Seth Friend, yeah. And
Blacksmith shop. He was a member of the fire department himself. Seth
and
Good old Beverly Daves, John. I think Chief Grant's house sat right next to Macaulay Drug, the vacated Macaulay Drug
yeah,
store.
right in there somewhere.
That house
yeah,
that sits
that's
there
true.
belonged to the chief. Speaking of Chief Grant, he was probably the transitional fire chief in Beverly, because his time dates back to the horse wagon, the steamer, whatever.
Yeah.
And he went right into the motorized era of Beverly's fire department history. Do any of you have any knowledge or recollections of Chief Grant? I know he was a bit before your time.
Well, I looked up his funeral. I found out when he died, and I looked that up in the library. And he started in the fire department as a torch boy, which was a young boy that carried a torch to light up the weight of the firemen pulling the hand engines. So he started long before horses, and he retired. Of course, it was motorized when he retired, wasn't it?
I had met him once. My father had to go to Central for something, and I remember meeting this white-haired gentleman up there, and my father telling me that he was the chief, but that was the one and only time.
He was well into his 80s, I believe, and still...
I think he was 85 there. There's a picture
Yeah,
of
he's
North
chief.
Beverly.
85.
Says that he is
Might have died at
the
86.
oldest.
He died 1 year after that picture was taken.
Yeah, he was the oldest
At
fire
85,
chief.
he was the oldest fire chief in the country.
Yeah.
And at 86, he died at the age of 86.
Yeah. Now, you couldn't do that today, right?
No,
You couldn't,
no.
couldn't be that old
No.
and still be...
Well, that's because of Chick McLean. Chick McLean, didn't like Creasy, Chief Creasy. Creasy was sort of a character, coarse, rough talking, swore, and Mayor McLean didn't care too much about that, so he had a special bill put through the legislature requiring firemen to retire at the age of 65. Well, Creasy was way over the age of 65, and he was probably in his 70s, but the law affected him, and he had to get through.
Yeah.
Him and several others.
So he-
now today it's mandatory you get through at 65, but before that you could stay forever.
There are a lot.
And I'm sure Creasy would have if he could.
Of course, at the time, it was quite a to-do in the department and in town, and there were a lot of people looking to take over Chief Cressy's job there. And like I said, there were all sorts of plans being made in City Hall. This was going to be changed, that was going to be changed, and everybody was moving around, and they telling Creasy to pack his bags and go, and little did they know that Chief Cressy had